Hello, everyone. Today I am speaking with a very special guy, a very dear friend of mine, Jim Willis. Jim is the author of over 13 books and counting. His books are on such wide-ranging topics as theology, alternative history, spirituality, esoteric phenomena, archetypal psychology. And Jim and I got to be friends over the past few years because we actually don't live that far from one another. And I heard Jim had been on several radio programs, and so we kind of connected. Jim's frequently on all kinds of podcasts on Coast to Coast AM with George Norrie. So he's a fairly busy guy. So, but I kind of feel like this is an important conversation that he and I are going to have about kind of reenchantment of the world. So, first, Jim, thanks as always for chatting with me today.
Oh, good. Thank you, Paul. Good to be with you as always.
Yeah. Well, I want to read something off your website, and then I want you to kind of tell us a little more. So I'm reading from Jim's website, which, by the way, is jimwillis.net. And this is Jim wrote, when I retired to the woods of South Carolina, I wanted to experience a passion similar to those who built Stonehenge, strong enough to inspire me to move megaton boulders halfway across England. That is to say, I retired with an agenda. Okay, God, it's you and me. No structures, no restrictions, no theology, no holds barred. 24 hours a day. You are my only passion. You say you like a challenge? Bring it on. Like Jacob of old who wrestled with God, I had one prayer on my mind. I will not let you go until you bless me. Imagine my surprise when in a totally unexpected way, God answered and did just that. And I think it's safe to say that God, and I'll do that in the quotation there, answered in a way that was quite unexpected. And if you don't mind, Jim, will you kind of tell us kind of, what happened there?
Oh, sure. Uh, I, as a young child, I was born and raised in a Christian church, and we were all active in the music department, sang in the choirs, grew up, directed the choirs, and all that kind of thing. But I can't say that I was ever really a believer. It was just part of my life. And when I went to college, I pretty much fell away, even though I stayed in the church. I stayed conducting choirs because good money in it for a college kid. And also, when you're in the church, you're in a pretty safe place if you're in the choir because you're in back of the pastor who's talking. He's not talking to you, he's talking to everybody else.
Mhm.
And so when I got out of college, I went through a pretty dark night of the soul. It took me down way deep, and I was saved from that experience by a rather dramatic conversion experience in the classic Billy Graham tradition. And I didn't know that this had happened to anybody else. And so I did what I thought you did when you had an experience like this, an experience of the holy. I went out and went to seminary. And at seminary, I was way over my head. I wasn't a good student. I didn't know enough yet. And it was pretty tough. And when I had the opportunity to become the pastor of a small part-time church after seminary, I said, here we go. I'm joining up a spiritual community. This is going to be great. We're going to go out, we're going to grow together, and we're all going to be excited, and it'll be great. And then I found out it's not like that at all. When you're the pastor of an independent church, as I was in the United Church of Christ, you're basically a CEO of a small corporation, and you do all the things that CEOs do. You got to worry about the next business meeting. You got to worry about raising money. You got to worry about expanding the congregation. You got to worry about social commitments out in the community and being in front of people. And the next thing I knew, I did this, and I think I did it well from the comments and things that I had. My music came into play, my public speaking and teaching seminars and studying and all this kind of stuff. It was all great, but next thing I knew, man, 40 years went by and I was no closer to God. As a matter of fact, I may have been farther away. My original fundamentalist evangelical theology collapsed and I write about that in some of my books. And I just really had nothing. And I've been across the gamut of the Christian spectrum, from very conservative to very liberal. I still consider myself a Christian today, although I'm sure there are many of my old Christian friends who do not consider me Christian any longer because my theology has changed so much. But I still find myself at home in Christianity. It's where I spent my life. I don't look at it historically or literally, the Bible, I mean, as I used to. Um, but I love the metaphors. I think there's some deep, deep psychological, spiritual, religious metaphors in Christianity that I can't get away from. Next week, I'm going to be doing a conference for Ancient Origins magazine, a Zoom conference, and I'll be talking about the myth of the Eden story in the book of Genesis, and talking about different ways of interpretation. And I always liked that, but I was always teaching about, that's what ministers do. You teach it about Christianity, about God. And even when I went to become a college professor and I was teaching world religions, I had great students. I mean, let's face it, no college student takes a course in world religions unless they want to. So I had the cream of the crop, and it was great. But I was talking again about all these things. And so when I retired early, as soon as I possibly could at age 62, when I retired from ministry, I wanted to go on retreat. I wanted to come out here into the woods of South Carolina, and I wanted to confront God. And I had that Bible verse in my head. Uh, I will not let you go until you bless me. I wanted to struggle with divinity. I wanted to struggle with the holy. I wanted a personal experience of divinity, of God. Again, I'll put the quotation marks around it like you did. Um, and so I came out here to go on retreat, and Barb and I, we built this house out here, and we were going to stay for 1 year and just experience the Bible verse. I will not let you go until you bless me, turns out to have been a very, very significant point in my life, because the verse comes from the book of Genesis. Jacob and Esau, the two brothers, had a falling out. And Jacob had stolen his brother's birthright, and he was forced to flee for his life. And so he left to go up into what is now present day Turkey, probably around the town of Sanliurfa, where his great grandfather Abraham had come from. And he was estranged from Esau for a long time. Well, finally, he made his way back. They were going to make up. And the night before they were going to meet, Jacob was on one side of the river, Esau was on the other side, and Jacob was doing what we all do when we have to face a difficult day. He was scared, and he was walking up and down and anxious and everything. He was walking up and down on the riverbank, and crazy story in the Bible. This man appears to him, and quite naturally, they decide to wrestle all night. I don't know why. But as in the morning, as the dawn breaks, it turns out that Jacob realizes he's wrestling with God. As a matter of fact, his name was changed from Jacob to Israel, which means he wrestles with God. And he said to him, he just wouldn't give up. He says, I will not let you go until you bless me. And finally, God blessed him. So that verse was on my mind when I came out here. I was going to be like Jacob of old. I was going to wrestle with God. I have to tell you the sequel to this story at this point, because it was such a monumental point in my life. A number of years ago, I was asked to go to Cornwall in the UK. And there I was going to give a lecture on world religions and the shamanic basis roots for all world religions today. And I had a wonderful time with them. But I'd never been to England before. And when I was over in England, after I finished the seminar and had a great time, I rented a car, drove on the wrong side of the road all the way up to a little town called Fenny Compton, northwest of London, or northwest of London. And the reason I had to go to Fenny Compton was because my ancestors, my great however many greats, ancestors from long ago, were pastors, were ministers in the Church of England, and they preached in this little stone church, which is still standing in Fenny Compton. And so when I went up there, I said, "Oh boy, here we go. I'm going to see where my ancestors were." And I found a historian in the town who took me into the church, and the church is still standing after all these years and all these hundreds of years. And she took me inside, and I stood in the pulpit where my ancestor preached. And there in the pulpit, I was able to see the original stained glass windows that were still there. And there was one window that can really only be seen from the pulpit correctly. And when I was up there looking at that window where my ancestor looked for time after time, Sunday after Sunday, all the time he preached there in that little church, and it was a picture depicting Jacob wrestling with God, saying, "I will not let you go until you bless me." Mm. Oh, I want to tell you, the hair stood up on the back of my neck. How that spiritual DNA came down here and managed to infect me here, I don't know, but it was just a wonderful, wonderful experience. I'm sure that God has a sense of humor and is laughing, because I can't figure out any other reason why this whole thing would have happened. So when I came out here to the woods, that was the verse. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the verse that was going to guide my whole life. "I will not let you go until you bless me." And I just opened myself up. No congregation. I didn't have to justify what I was doing to anybody. Didn't have to prove myself to an ordination committee or anything like that. And we just opened ourselves up. And lo and behold, for the first time in my life, weeks went by, and I never set foot in a church. We just stayed here Sunday morning, getting up and not going to church. I'd never done that before. And here I was doing it. And now we were going to stay for 1 year, and now it's been 12, 13 years, something like that. And lo and behold, God broke through, divinity broke through, the holy broke through, Brahman, the source, whatever you want to call it. And I found all of a sudden an entirely new spirituality. As I look back on it, probably it had to be that way, because if the spirit, I had probably closed off the spirit through my Christianity, because it was just so common for me. And I would just say, "Oh yeah, this verse, that verse, and everything else." But the holy, the spiritual that I connected with here was a much different form than Christianity. It has much more to do with what today we might call shamanism, the nature religion, finding God in nature, but finding God above nature and realizing we're all connected in it. And that was the genesis of my book, the Quantum Akashic Field, for instance. I call it a field guide for astral travelers, out of body experience, which is a shamanic experience. And I'm convinced that that was the experience that is at the root of every world religion. I had to come out here to the woods of South Carolina. Jesus went out in the desert. Moses saw the burning bush. Muhammad went out to the cave where he met Gabriel, the angel who said, "Write," and wrote the Quran. I think the founders of basically every single world religion in the world today had this shamanic experience. I think it's very common. And I think if we slow our lives down, all of us can have this opportunity. But that, I think, is the basis of all the world religions, which were formed, of course, not by the founders. They didn't form their own religion. It was the followers of the founders who built all the walls and the doctrine and the dogmas and everything else. So that was my story, how the ages of between 62 and 65 discovered a brand new spirituality.
It's to me, listening to you talk, it sounds as if what you experienced was, like you say, of that universal thread, and it's every culture has to put their own stamp on it. For example, I call what I'm sitting in a chair, but other cultures who have different language will call it something else,
Mhm.
because it's not the thing that's named. It's like Lao Tzu said, the Tao is, if
Yeah,
you're naming the Tao, it's beyond words.
yeah,
Alan
right.
Watts said, the menu's not the meal.
Yeah,
And
that's
so you're,
wonderful.
yeah, you've had your own kind of way, and you're trying to, I think probably initially, and correct me if I'm wrong, you were trying to fit it into a paradigm that's a limited paradigm, as they all are.
Mhm.
And I think we sometimes get so used to seeing things through our own paradigm that it limits our ability to fully experience,
Yeah,
the
yeah,
world maybe as it more is. I mean,
yeah,
what do you
yeah.
think?
Oh, I think you're absolutely right. Um, the the holy will break through. Sometimes we're not expecting it. I'm not saying it doesn't exist in Christianity. I'm saying it didn't exist in Christianity for me because I was the guy up in front leading the service. If I was conducting the choir or singing in the choir or doing the sermon, I was always thinking I couldn't experience it. I am sure because I've had people tell me that sometimes the holy broke through during those church services and people experienced it, but I wasn't interested in just that quick experience. Like, was it Edna St. Vincent Millay wrote that wonderful poem on hearing a symphony of Beethoven, and sometimes listening to great music or seeing great art or hearing the right phrase said by a teacher or something like that. All of a sudden, it breaks through for a moment. But so I'm not saying it can't happen. As a matter of fact, I don't ever encourage anybody to leave the religion there. And I'm just saying, look for the holy in it, and it will show up. But when it does come through, it usually doesn't last. At least it didn't for me. And I was interested in finding the way that to walk in that reality. And it you like you say, it means breaking down the doors of the paradigm sometimes. It's very difficult.
Mhm. Guys, I'm reminded as you were talking that the classic a parable of Plato about the cave. And
Oh,
those who
yes.
haven't heard it, it's that people are chained up in a cave and they're looking at shadows on the wall, and these shadows are these fires that are behind them, and it's people walking behind them, but they're mistaking the shadows on the cave for reality. But then one guy decides to look around and just unshackles himself and goes out of the cave, and he's like, what is all this? And
Yeah.
then it's kind of like that experience going out of that paradigm. But the problem is, and Plato was very wise in many ways, is that when he comes back and tries to let everyone know, they think he's either crazy
Yeah.
or or a rabble rouser, or so they'll either like run him off, kill him, ignore him. He's a nut. And I think the thing is, there's that element of humility that's very difficult, because
Yeah.
when we have an experience of something more than ourselves, whatever that experience is, and it's like you say, it's different for each person. I think we have a tendency to want to rush back and say, hey, I had this and you need to have this and you need to, and then people, it's like you're speaking a foreign language and they're not going to understand. And
Yeah.
or worse, they do think they understand, and then it elevates our ego to where,
Hmm.
in some cases
Oh,
insert cult leader.
exactly.
So it takes a little
Exactly.
bit of that humility.
History shows that we do not treat our visionaries very well.
Yeah.
We almost always crucify them, or something close to it. Anybody with a vision of that's beyond, that was the whole idea of Plato's myth of Atlantis, for instance. He said that the people of in his story Atlantis, whether you believe it's a myth or based on an actual reality, doesn't make any difference. The story is that hubris brought those people down. Their reach was farther than their grasp, and they started to say, "Oh, what a good boy." And in one day, they were brought low.
Mhm.
um, it's a dangerous path, the path of walking the really spiritual. Jesus warned his disciples about it. He said, now you must pick up your cross daily and follow me. um, we are not very good to visionaries. We don't like them. I'm sure that when the first shaman, possibly under the influence of a mushroom or something like that, had a vision, went into the cave 40,000 years ago in Eastern Europe and tried to paint his picture on the cave of what he saw in his vision. And of course, you can't express it with words. It's beyond thought. He came out and talked about his vision to the tribe, and I'm certain that one of those people in the tribe went home to the cave that night and said, honey, you won't believe what this guy just came out. He's gone over the deep end, he's out there. Joseph Campbell quoted Heinrich Zimmer in a wonderful way when he said, Zimmer said that the best things in life we can't talk about because they go beyond language to express. The second best are not really true because they're words that try to describe what we can't talk about. The third best is what we all talk about every day. That wonderful story of the Buddha wanted to express something to his disciples, and of course words did not work. So all he did was hold up a flower. Didn't say it. They held up a flower. And Kashyapa, one of the disciples, looks at it and just kind of looked at the Buddha and gave him a nod that he got it, but you can't talk about it. I had an experience of this. Well, the first semester I was teaching Hinduism. I really wanted to get it right. And I came to the point in teaching Hinduism where we were going to be talking about the Hindu concept of Brahman and Atman. Brahman is the inexpressible. The words cannot touch him. You can't describe Brahman. If you think you've hedged him in with words, you've missed it. And Atman is the inner self. The best English word, I guess, is probably soul. And the great breakthrough of Hinduism was that thou art that. Atman and Brahman are one, the outer and the inner, the immanent and the expressible, inexpressible. So I want to make sure I got it right. So I went to a good friend of mine who had a little shop. He was practiced one of the Hindu family of religions, and he had his little shop, and in the back of his shop he had a little table set up with candles and everything else. It was really great. And I wanted to make sure I got it right. So I said, listen, I got a lecture about this afternoon. I want to make sure I get it right. Can I give you my lecture and you tell me? So I mentioned all about Brahman. You can't describe Brahman. You can't define Brahman. You can't pin Brahman down. And I'm talking about it. Here I am describing the undescribable. And at the end I said, did I get it right? And he put his head up and down and he said, no. And he said, very difficult subject. Well, this was a school situation. I had to deliver the lecture and talk about it. How else can you going to do it? So I went in and I gave the lecture, and all the kids, and this was mostly a young class right out of high school, and they were all nodding their heads and they were getting it. Well, a couple of weeks later, I had to give an exam because it was a college situation. I hate giving exams on religion, but I had to do it. So I gave an exam, and on the exam, I guess I hadn't learned my lesson because one of my questions was for 5 points. In one well-written paragraph, describe the Hindu concept of Brahman. Well, kids all got too busy in that, they figuring it out, and they were writing in there. One of my best students, a guy by the name Paul, of all things, he when I corrected his exam that night, he had left it blank. He hadn't written a thing. So the next day I went back to class and I passed out the things. And Paul is sitting in the back row and he's smiling like a Cheshire cat. I mean, and he raised his hand after the exams were all passed back. And he said, Professor Willis, did everybody answer question 5? And I said, well, Paul, they at least tried. And he looked at me and grinned and said, you mean I'm the only one who got it right? I had to give the guy 5 points for turning in a blank. I had to correct his exam. And he was absolutely right. You can't really describe the inexpressible. And I want to tell you, for a writer, that's a horrible thing to say. So I come back here and I have this experience of the holy And what do? I sit down and write books about it. Sometimes I think I probably never learned my lesson very well after all.
Yeah. I remember years ago talking with a Zen monk, and another person in our group asked, "Well, what's the meaning of Zen?" And he said this.
Ah,
He says, "What's the meaning of that?" And they're like, "What?" And it's like, "Oh, I get it. It's like,
ah,
what are you projecting on it? Because whatever you're projecting on it, it's not the meaning of it. You know,
yeah,
oh, you're
yeah,
making a point. Oh, you're making a sound, or this means that, or that means this.
yeah.
It's kind of so that's hard for us, particularly our Western mind, which
Oh,
we
yeah,
love dichotomies, either or. And it's like it's either this or it's that. Give me my simple, easy spirituality,
bumper
that
sticker. Yeah,
I can just, I read a couple of things, and maybe, I don't know, let me ask you this as I'm saying that, from a guy who was very well read, still is, but who knew like you say, the orthodoxy, uh, and then you go out in the woods and you start having these odd experiences. I mean, odd
yeah.
from the context you came from. That
Mhm.
required you to really, didn't it?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah, that was the trouble. When I wrote Quantum Akashic Field, I had to go into my own dream journal and my out of body experience journal. And I had to use the words that I used when I came back from an out of body experience, because how are you going to explain it? You got to use language, but language was used to describe stuff on this side
Mhm.
of the perception fence, not the other. So you can't say what I perceived was this. All you can say is what I was perceived was something like this. And that has been the shamanic problem of all who have had visions, dreams, out of body experiences. You come back and you try to explain it, and you've just experienced a world which seems very real. Matter of fact, more real, more vivid than this. But then you come back and you have to describe it in a language that was invented to describe things on this side of the perception fence.
Yeah.
How do you do it? You have a little Rolodex in your mind that goes off and said, well, I can't really describe the experience, but I've had other experiences similar, so it must have been something like this. And you pick one. And that's why you get all these fantastic stories about human beings with animal heads and all these fantastical creatures and experiences. It isn't that that's what you saw. It's that your brain is saying that's the closest I can come to explaining what I saw. The
Mhm.
Apostle Paul, I think, said it so much better than me. In 2 Corinthians 9, I think it is, he describes his own out of body experience. And he talks about being taken to the third heaven. And he says, whether in the body or out the body, I don't know. God knows, he says. And he described that a little bit earlier in 1 Corinthians chapter 13, when he said, now we see through a window, a glass, dimly, he
Yeah.
said. And I think what he was doing was talking about our perception fence. We see only dimly now. But he said, and wonderful words, then I shall see face to face.
Mhm.
I've had the experience of talking to a lot of people, especially as a pastor, when I've gone to visit people in the hospital who have died, flatlined, and they kick me out of the room and they come in and they hook up all the tubes and do all this stuff, and the person comes back. And I have yet to find anybody who's had a near-death experience who wanted to come back. They all wanted to stay. They all said the same thing. It's so real
Mhm.
on the other side that this seems like a real come down to come back to this world, but they knew they must, so they did. Um, Leave it to Harry Potter when he had that wonderful near-death experience and says to Dumbledore, is this real or is it just happening in my head? And Dumbledore says the great line, of course it's happening in your head, but what makes you think it's not real?
Right, right,
you know,
right. Yeah. That
so
reminds me of a book title I think Lon Milo Duquette wrote. It's something like, it's about magic, and he says, uh, it's all in your head. You just don't have any idea how big your head is.
yeah, I love that. That quote is gonna, I'm gonna write that one down.
Yeah.
That's terrific.
Well, let me ask you this. looking back, you started in your early 60s having this change in your life, this kind of reenchantment of your world. If you go back to your 50 years old, and would you have any idea that the Jim of today, who, I mean, found a nature-based spirituality, and who's out uh, doing dowsing and
Yeah.
all these things that you're doing now, and talking about out of body, non-local consciousness. Would you have thought that, if that had been your dad, hypothetically, would you have said, well, dad's definitely gone off the deep end with that perspective back then?
Um, a good deal of my life, yeah, I would. Um, it all changed for me um, when I had probably one of the most life-changing experiences of my life. I've written about this in one of my books too, and that was when I met a nude woman on a rock. I my
So right now, everybody who's listening suddenly got
well, it was a strange thing. I was a fundamentalist minister. By this time, probably I would have been described myself as evangelical. And I was making the mistake that I think most conservative religious people, whether they're Jewish or Islam or Christian, make, and that's that we look to the texts so much to describe things for us that basically, without realizing it, the text kind of takes over for God. We start worshiping a text, an interpretation, a particular interpretation of a text. In my case, it was biblical text. And that's fine until you begin to worry that you're not preaching the God anymore, but preaching about God. You're preaching about a certain way to interpret the Bible text. Well, it all fell apart for me one night. I was getting a sermon ready on a Saturday night, and I realized that by this time I knew the Bible so well. I had taught all the way through it 4 or 5 times. I read it, dozens of times all the way through. And I knew there were mistakes in the text. I mean, not mistakes, but I knew there were discrepancies. And if you can't describe those discrepancies within your system, and the Bible falls apart, your system of understanding the Bible falls apart, then God falls apart because you put God down and the text up. I thought I was going to have to leave the ministry. I thought I had nothing to preach about anymore. I just could not keep that same theology anymore. So I decided to go off on a retreat. I had built a little log cabin up in the woods in New Hampshire. And I went up there for 4 or 5 days and just wanted to be by myself, and thinking about the third day in, maybe the fourth day in, I had decided I'd go for a good climb. And there was a mountain in back. There are 3 mountains, and I wanted to climb to the middle mountain. I wanted to climb up there because the climb was challenging. And so it would have, tired me out a little bit, given me plenty of time to think. And the best thing was I had never seen anybody up there. And it was a great way to look out on the world, big granite top, and just think. So here I was, the conservative, either fundamental or evangelical minister, made my way up to the top, stepped out of the woods into the beautiful granite top overlooking southern New Hampshire. And there was a woman sunbathing in the nude on a rock on the top. And I mean, wow, for a fundamentalist minister, there's nothing more dangerous than finding a woman in the nude. I mean, there's nothing more scary than a naked human body, out and surrounded by nature. Wow. I mean, to this day, God has a sense of humor. I think, I climbed up on that rock, just like Moses climbed to the top of the mountain. And instead of giving me the 10 commandments, he introduces me to a nude woman on a rock, which was horribly, according to us fundamentalists, sinful, terrible, flee. And so I turned to walk away. And she said, "Well, hey, hi, come on over." So, how do you say no to a nude woman on a rock, right? So I walked over and I sat down on the rock, and we started talking. And she was into all of the stuff that back then we called New Age. She was into crystals and ESP and all of all this stuff. And we just talked and talked. And about halfway through that afternoon, I realized this was the first really spiritual conversation I was having with somebody for a long time. With most Christian people, even pastors, all you do is compare Bible texts, you know?
Mhm.
And she was really interested in what I had to say. She wanted to know, what I believed and why I believed. When she found out I was a minister, she didn't try to, put down my religion or pull me away for it, change it or anything like that. And we just talked, and I was fascinated what she had to say. And here were two people from two totally different traditions who were actually meeting together and sharing rather than fighting with each other and saying, you got to be like me. And when we finished and I went down the mountain one way and she went down the other way, I said to her before I left, I don't even know your name. And she said, does it matter? And she walked down the hill and I walked down the hill. When I came down that hill, just like Moses, I may not have had the 10 commandments, but I had a new way of living. And all of a sudden I realized that all of the dissension between religions, because we try to say I'm right and you're wrong, it doesn't have to be that way. When honest seekers, honest people journeying along the way of life, when they can sit down with each other and actually talk, we can learn from one another.
Mhm.
And boy, my theology just opened up that day. And after that day, if you had asked me, could I ever envision what I am now, I probably would have said yes. Before that day, I would have said no.
Yeah.
That was the culminating moment for me.
Right. Yeah. Well, as you're talking about the abandoning the text, or at least not using that as your primary focus, I think for a lot of people, just in general, human nature is to go off script, metaphorically,
Yeah.
is opening to the mysterious and uncertainty. And we
Mm,
don't like uncertainty. It creates anxiety.
yeah.
And so if I can say, well, I do know the truth, and the truth is insert whatever dogma, it gives me a sense of security, and like, okay, even if it's an imagined security, but to
Yeah.
finally go like, look, I don't know nothing. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have no idea. And I think, isn't that why Socrates thought he was the wisest man in Athens? Because he realized he didn't know anything.
Yeah.
The whole
Yeah.
epistemology is just, how do you know what you know? And
Yeah.
I think that you went for, at that point, and certainly in your 60s, you started going, instead of a script, you went for experience. And the
Oh,
experience was uh, more real than all the, like you said, we've been talking about the writings about the
yeah.
experience.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, that's got to bring up Joseph Campbell again when he talked about this. He said people are very interested. We always say, well, we want to know the meaning of life. And Joseph Campbell will say, meaning has to do with the mind and with language and with doctrine and with dogma. He says, I don't think we're looking for the meaning of life. I think what we're looking for is the experience of being alive. And I like that. I really do. We kind of tend to associate openness sometimes, I think, and open-mindedness. We tend to associate it with weakness. And I think it's a tremendous strength instead. What we need is a lot more open people. Can you imagine what Washington, D.C. would be like if politicians on both sides of the aisle would really start listening to each other and wondering if maybe the guy on the other side, maybe he has some ideas that are good, and maybe we can compromise, maybe we can get together without showing our weakness, the world would change.
Right.
Same thing with countries. Instead of us being in an economic war with China. Wouldn't it be a great idea if leaders could actually sit down and say, you got some great ideas, we got some great ideas. How can we combine this so that the people can get together? We just need that. I think it's the biggest thing that's needed in the world today. If we started to do that, we could solve all the world's problems in a week.
Absolutely. And at the same time, the paradox is that as human beings, we
Yeah.
have that ego side that kind of, to always be, and that maybe that's the balance in the world, where you have the open mind. In order to have an open mind, you have to have a closed mind, because you can't
Mm.
have, one without the other. And it's navigating that, which is so blasted hard.
Yeah, yeah. I,
Yeah.
I I think right now you just put your finger on the essential difference between Christianity and Buddhism. Christianity is a religion that's steeped in dualism,
Mm,
right and wrong, good and bad. You know, and because of that, we are taught in Christianity to identify with the right or the good and push away from the bad, the evil.
mhm,
And as a result, Christianity is more about ethics. This is how you're supposed to act in a way that enhances the good. Buddha had a terribly different idea, a wonderfully different idea about that. He saw the sense of duality. He said, you cannot have, as you just said, you cannot have uh, good and bad and identify with one and not accept the other because both are part of life. You have to find what he called the middle way
mhm.
between the two, to that point that beyond both of them, that embraced both. Everything that's good for us is probably bad for somebody else. I like to I like to tell the story of sitting on my front porch one time up in Massachusetts. I was beautiful spring day. Oh, the grass had turned green and the robins were back, and the robins were, pecking around on the ground, and the trees were beginning to leaf out and everything else. And I said, boy, it just doesn't get any better than this. This is all good. And then I realized, well, it's all good from here, but what if you're a worm? I mean, the robins were eating
Right.
the worms. That's what they were down there for. My harbinger of spring was somebody else's demon from on high who came to eat the kids.
Exactly.
It's always there's good or there's bad, and we somehow have to get to the idea of somehow embracing both, and maybe that's a good thing we need to do for our mental health too. I mean, maybe we need to be able to understand that when things are really difficult, um, it's all part of life.
Mhm. Yeah. I wanted to ask you a little bit about uh, your change into how you see things, into the idea of uh, sometimes we call earth energy,
Mhm.
those kind of things that you've studied a lot about. And it seems to me that that's a big thread in how you started to view the world around you as being more alive. And as a result, that you're more interconnected with that nature. And
Yeah.
could you tell me a little bit about what kind of moved you in that direction?
When people talk about earth energy, and that's what got me really into dowsing today, discovering currents that actually run currents of energy that you can't explain. We used to say they were um, electromagnetic currents. Now we tend to say, oh, maybe it's a quantum kind of an idea. But when you begin to discover those, you begin to understand that it's a very real part of life, and that's what dowsing is, and is being able to discover those. Dowsing rods are just kind of like an antenna, and you're the TV, and
Mhm.
the antenna shows you the forces that are surging through you all the time, but you just don't realize it until you
Yeah.
have the antenna shows you. Then you can get the picture on the screen. So when you begin to look at that, you realize you're not really talking about a mystical thing or a spiritual thing. You're just talking about a science that we don't understand yet, because quantum theory is teaching us that everything is connected. Um, when we say we come from Earth, we are really a manifestation, really, when you come right down to it, of earth energy. We're part of this energy. The earth is Mother Earth. It's a wonderful thing, Gaia. She is the womb from which we all spring.
Mhm.
And that doesn't mean we're just tethered here, but it means that this is a field, a materialistic field through which we are moving. Who knows what's on the other side when we get out of the other side? Science talks about the newly discovered Higgs field, for instance, which and now has been discovered through the work of the brilliant scientists at CERN in Switzerland. And they talk about a Higgs field. They talk about pure energy moving through the Higgs field, slowing down, so to speak. Sometimes they call it like a field of molasses, or sometimes a
Mhm.
field of treacle over in England, they say. And the energy moves through that field and slows down and becomes mass. Of course, Einstein discovered the equation, E equals mc squared. Energy equals mass. They're the same thing. Well, who knows that, we know that the Higgs field is real and energy moves through it and takes on mass here in this world, but who knows whether this material field in which we're living isn't just another field that we are moving through. And when we get to the other side, when death comes and we leave this particular field, who knows what's next? I, I want to know. I don't want to be morbid, but I'm kind of looking forward to it,
Mhm.
because we're just passing through. We really are,
Mhm.
and we don't understand nearly enough about this material life. But I think we understand enough to know that it's a temporary thing, and we are eternal.
Mhm. I just wanted to share a story. I remember when uh, I had come over to visit you and your wife, Barb, and we went out in the front yard because he brought up dowsing, and I'm
Oh yeah.
naturally kind of a left brain linear skeptical person, and you said, well, let's just go out and try it. So I had the rods, and you said, well, walk from this part of the yard to the other. Keep your eyes closed. We'll guide you so you don't trip. And so I'm going along and I'm going really slow. And I know that the rods, are hanging. I've got my eyes closed. And all of a sudden, Barb starts laughing. She says, they're crossed. And sure enough, they went not just a little bit, they just real quickly. And then y'all were laughing. And I
I
said,
will never forget the look on your face when that, it's a wonderful thing. It happens to everybody when they first have that experience. I love it.
and what had happened, I was standing in the middle of this place that you call the shaman's circle.
Yeah.
And it was really odd that the second I stepped in that's when, I mean, just immediately.
Yeah.
And I'm kind of like, that makes no sense. And so, of course, I had to do it again and again, and every time. So
Yeah.
the psychologist in me, okay, you got ideomotor, stuff, but it's like, it really was puzzling to me. And you said, well, just do this, step out of it without the rods and step into it. And I have to admit, if I'm completely honest, I felt slightly different when I stepped in this
Yeah.
area. And for those who obviously have not been to Jim's house, it's like this whole kind of area of rock and quartz and kind of just naturally occurring. That's a little bit of work that you have put into it, and it is an interesting place to just sit. It does feel different, and that
Yeah.
was really
Yeah.
surprising to me.
And since you were here, we've discovered something else about that particular shaman circle. When you said naturally occurring, we discovered that it isn't. Um, it is actually, we're convinced now, what it actually was an old rock effigy, probably in the form of an eagle or a hawk,
Wow.
that had been built up. We discovered, we haven't got enough time to get into the whole thing. So maybe someday we can do that, because it's a fascinating story. Andrew Collins, who is probably the world's foremost authority right now on the Cygnus swan and the Cygnus effigies around the world. When we wrote to him and talked to him about it, we've since become long distance friends. And he asked if there were any effigies like this around our area. And of course, right over the river in Georgia, if you go about 70 miles inland, you'll find the two great effigies that were built thousands of years ago. One is the hawk effigy and one is the eagle effigy. And we have since discovered that that's what this probably is. It was probably destroyed when the very first white people came here, white settlers came here, and they wanted rocks to define things or build in their houses, and they began to raid the thing. And of course, what's left is scattered around the ground. But we've since identified and actually put out flags once the shape of this thing, and it's just amazing. It looks like a rock effigy. So apparently, whatever the energies that you experienced there have been experienced by people for good long time on this piece of ground.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, thinking about those kind of things, what if somebody came to you and said, Jim, I'm searching. I'm trying to figure out, all these things that I've heard you and Paul talk about in this conversation. How do I have this re-enchanted kind of re-enchanted life, because we lose so much of that enchantment as from the time we're
Yeah.
children. How does one do that? What advice would you give to someone who wants a re-enchantment of daily life?
Well, I've developed a system that I outline in my book, Quantum Akashic Field. It's a 6-part system that um, I didn't really invent it. I shaped it a little bit, but most of it came from Bill Buellman, who I think is probably the world's foremost teacher right now on out-of-body experience. I had studied with Bill up at Monroe Institute. And but the number one part of that decision is to make the decision. It sounds kind of silly. How do I go about experiencing this? Well, number one, you got to decide you want to do it. And then the second part is just as important, and that's after you've made the decision, stick to it. In my case, I use meditation and hemisync music and all this kind of thing. I was just kind of led to that, and some of it I've developed on my own. And I talk about quite a bit in the book. But number one, making the decision and then sticking to it, it has to become one of the most important parts of your life. And that's, I think, the trouble with modern day life today. We don't stick to things. I mean, we say we want to do it. So, we try to meditate for 15 minutes on a weekend, or I'll take a weekend off or something like that. Take a weekend off. That's not nearly enough. That's why we had to come out here in the woods and really slow down. We live in a left brain analytical world that is so noisy and so fast and so loud that it's just very difficult for people to get away. I've seen people who can't meditate because after 10 minutes, they just have to check their cell phone, see if they have any messages.
Right.
I'm just writing a book. As a matter of fact, you're in the midst of reading it right now, because you're the first one I sent a manuscript copy to, and where Snow White, the evil queen, is looking in her mirror, who's the fairest of them all. And I kind of equate that with looking in the computer every morning. We got to get up, turn on the computer.
Right,
How
right.
many hits did we get last night? How many people, wrote to us? Am I the fairest in the land? And if we get a bunch of hits, oh, look, I'm number one. And if we don't, that kind of an attitude just makes it almost impossible to have real spiritual experiences. It's no mistake that down through the ages, monks and nuns and gurus have all gone into the wilderness to get away. Sometimes you just have to do that. Joseph Campbell talked about the importance of every day going into a quiet room and listening to the music that you like to listen to and just following your bliss, he called it, and be alone. Boy, people can't be alone anymore. Our attention spans are getting shorter and shorter. It scares the living daylights out of me, because I find it with me. Last couple of weeks, I have forced myself every day to sit down and listen to a Brahms symphony or a Beethoven symphony or a Mozart symphony all the way through, because I'm just used to listening to segments here and there and then get on to the next thing. It's a terrible life we've invented. I thought it was going to be better. To be honest, I thought it was going to be one of the good things that was going to come out of the COVID pandemic, that people were forced to stay home and be quiet. But I think instead of using it as a spiritual experience, it just drove us all nuts. That's all.
Well, I think it was Blaise Pascal who said that the root of man's problems is the inability to sit quietly in a room for an hour.
Yeah. You go into the next time you're in a dentist's office or a doctor's office and you're sitting in the waiting room. Most of them don't have magazines out now because of the COVID thing. And watch the people in the room. They will sit down and within 10 seconds, they're reaching for their cell phone. And instead, what a wonderful time you're forced to just sit there in a chair and quiet. What a wonderful time to meditate. But no, people won't do that. They got to grab for that phone or grab for this, grab for that. It's
or
just,
even to connect.
yeah,
You see somebody and you just a connection, and we're so kind of, you know,
yeah,
not connect with
yeah,
people. So
yeah. That's that's one of the things that really drew me to long distance bicycle riding. Um, because when you're out there on a bike, it isn't safe to wear headphones or anything like that because you want to hear what's going on. And when you're bicycling long distances, and I'm talking about cross country trip, for instance, I've made a couple of them from California to Massachusetts and Florida to Massachusetts and that kind of thing. You're out there on the bike and it's a kind of a Zen thing. It's rhythmic. You're putting the pedals. You can't listen to anything. You just got to think, and you get into this whole wonderful meditative quality. I loved it. And every time I I would do a seminar for a bike group or something like that, they'd say, "Well, don't you take a phone with you?" No, I don't.
yeah,
I know it's hard for our kids to think that, we have, many of us survived for years without having a cell phone in our
right,
pocket and,
right, yeah.
and being out of touch. Uh, Nowadays, it's just really hard and it gets in the way of our spiritual life.
Mhm. Yeah, I had a friend who lived out in the southwestern United States, and he said anytime he had a problem, he would go out at night in his car on those lonely roads through the desert and
Yeah,
just set the cruise at 55 miles an hour and drive for an hour or two.
yeah,
When he came back, he had a solution to his problem. No radio, no passengers, and it was something that rhythmic moving of the car.
yeah,
There's nothing to see,
yeah,
literally,
yeah,
and it kind of forced him to kind of go inside, and
yeah.
up comes the answers if we're
Yep,
willing to hear them. You know.
yep, yep. Yeah, it's taken me my whole life to realize that's why I loved hunting and fishing my whole life. It wasn't the killing of the game or the catching of the fish. It was just being out in the woods by
Mhm.
myself. And you had to be quiet. You had to be in tune with nature. Now that I'm out here, I came out here to the woods of South Carolina and I thought I was going to be hunting and fishing every day out here. I'm retired. Don't even have to get a license every year. They give me one now that because I'm over 65, so I'm free. I haven't hunted a bit. I mean, I I don't need to. I can watch the deer off my back porch all year long, in season or out of season. And all the things that I loved about being alone in the woods, I now I now live in it.
Mhm.
So it makes a difference. So when you ask what do people need to do, well, that's a good start. Tune in, drop out, and I know that's kind of silly because people can't really do that nowadays. We've created a kind of life that, people have to pay the grocery bill and all this kind of stuff. So it's very difficult, but at least we can make small attempts. We
Mhm.
really can.
Yeah. Well, Jim, I want to thank you. It's a very heartfelt conversation that we've had today, and it always is. And I've, if people who have followed your work and they kind of wonder what kind of guy he really is, I will attest that the guy you see on these kind of interviews is the same guy, and you're very genuine, and that's, uh, a rare commodity, I think, these
Uh,
days. And I
well,
appreciate.
thank you, Paul. And as always, whenever we get together, it's just wonderful to talk with you, even long distance like
Yeah.
this. It's
Yeah.
wonderful to talk with you.
So real quickly, what's the best way if people want to find your work? Where's the way how
Uh,
do they find you?
Probably the best place is go to the website, www.jimwillis.net. And that'll also have links for my YouTube page and my Facebook page, let you know what's all coming out and what's happening. It's we just never know what the future is bringing. The big thing that we're looking at now, I have a long-term Zoom meeting tomorrow with one man who's in Greece and a woman who is in uh, she's either in Malaysia or I guess she just came back from South Africa, and we're talking about whether there's a possibility of leading a tour this May. We don't know whether it's going to happen or not, but it's scheduled to happen right now, to ancient sites in Turkey.
Oh,
And if any of your viewers are interested in seeing the ancient sites of Turkey for 10 days with a really like-minded crew. I'm going along as the the co-leader of the group, and my website will tell you whether that tour is going to be on. I'll find out tomorrow morning, but looks like it is. It's been postponed twice now because of the COVID thing, but now things are starting to open up, and we're talking about Göbekli Tepe and Sanliurfa and all of those wonderful places where our civilization began so long ago. So looks like fun. Those are the kinds of things that are going on. Of course, it'll also tell you when new books come out, and every time I think I've written my last book, it turns out I got one more that I have to have to write.
Yeah, it is funny how that works, isn't it?
Yeah, so jimwillis.net is probably the place to start.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much, Jim. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Paul. Always good to talk to you.